Chair. You can start, sir. You can start.
A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Good afternoon,
and of course, every one of you, members of this committee, as we reconvene this 8th meeting of the Joint Select Committee of the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on National Security. This meeting is being broadcast live on the Parliament's Channel 11 and Radio 105 FM and the Parliament's YouTube channel, ParlView. Let me take this opportunity to very heartily welcome the officials who we have invited to be with us today and who I'm advised are very present. Officials from Vision on Mission, a well-entrenched, well-established, well-reputed, non-governmental organization, and of course, of similar ilk and stature, I on Dependency. My name is Fitzgerald Ethelbert Hines, and I'm the chairman of this Joint Select Committee on National Security. I would like to ask my colleagues, other members of this committee, starting with Vice Chairman Mr. Richards, to, for the record and for your benefit and the benefit of the viewing and listening public, to introduce themselves in turn. Member Richards.
Good afternoon, everyone. Paul Richards, Vice Chair of the committee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jayanti Lachmidial, member of the committee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ayana Webster-Roy, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Keith Scotland, member.
I think that's the extent of our members so far. We have, of course, other members who are not immediately with us and who would join us perhaps as we proceed. Of course, let me as well ask the officials of Vision and Mission, followed by the officials of I on Dependency, to introduce yourselves for the record and for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners to this broadcast. Please.
Thank you very much, Chair and other members of the committee. My name is Gerald Wilson. I'm the chairman of the Board of Directors of Vision and Mission.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman, for your greetings. I am Giselle Chan, CEO of Vision and Mission.
I on Dependency.
Sorry, excuse, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry. Yes.
Sorry, could be Gordon Husbands, member of Vision and Mission.
Thank you very much, Mr. Husbands. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Garth St. Clair, Director of I on Dependency, NGO.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, Natasha Nunez, Secretary of Iron Dependency, the NGO, and co-host producer of Iron Dependency, the radio program.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much. Just to advise that this committee is very ably supported by our secretariat, which is led by the Clerk of the House in her capacity as secretary to this committee, Madam Jackie Sampson Miguel, and of course, Mr. Brian Caesar, the Clerk of the Senate of the Parliament of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and other members of the staff of the Parliament who consist of this secretariat, who are in our, as I indicated, very able support. And of course, we thank them for their tremendous work. The purpose of this meeting and inquiry is to explore the methods applied by Trinidad and Tobago, our state and other agencies, to combat organized crime, thereby circumventing its impact, particularly on the vulnerable youth of our society. The inquiry has a number of objectives. Some include to understand the specific measures implemented to identify vulnerable youth and to intervene prior to their gang involvement, engagement, or recruitment. Two, to investigate the process or progress made towards the transformation of the prisons and community residences from a punitive model of justice to a rehabilitative or restorative model of justice. Positions arrived at and accepted as government policy in Trinidad and Tobago as far back as 2002. Thirdly, to assess the continuum of service options intended to ensure reintegration of persons who found themselves in conflict with the law in this society and in other societies, because some from other societies made their way to Trinidad and Tobago in very many different ways. I would like to suggest, and all of us present on this platform, be mindful that we should take our phones down, get them on silent or muted, so that they will not encumber these proceedings this afternoon. Secondly, it is suggested that when you speak, as far as practicable, you look into your camera so that the focus would be where it ought to be. Please mute your mics when you are not actually speaking, and quite naturally and sensibly avoid any noises or other distractions when unmuted. Please use the raised hand feature on the system to gain my attention as chairman so that I will recognize the need for your intervention. I would now like to thank you all again for coming and to thank you for your very lucid and detailed written submissions, both you NGOs, upon this committee's request. We have read, we have studied them, and obviously, we provide you with an opportunity today to rehash them for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, and also for elucidation as we interface with you in this question and answer interrogation, aiming to find out what you do, how it's done, and what we ought to be doing by way of preventing or identifying vulnerable youth and directing them away from the path of imprisonment incarceration, death, and hurting other people as they in those circumstances do. I would like to now make the floor available to our first intervener, Mr. Paul Richards, who would present some questions to each of you organizations for your elucidation as contemplated. Mr. Richards.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon again, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I would like to start with vision and mission, and of course, I hadn't had a chance to interface with Mrs. Chance since the passing of her husband. Thank you for continuing the good work of your husband, and thank you, for, of course, on behalf of the committee for his astounding contribution to Trinidad and Tobago. It is not unrecognized. If you could give us a sense at the start of, in terms of persons you, in your intake, what sort of percentage, if you have that information, would you say would have been involved in gangs and you would have been able to remediate to some level? And also if you have information as to what the success rate or recidivism rate would be like in terms of trying to rehabilitate those persons. And then I'd go to the iron dependency representatives.
Okay, thank you so much, Vice Chair, for your kind words and your greetings as well. And regarding your first question as to what type of data we have in relation to inmates, first of all, in the prison that we treat with through our pre-release preparation for release program, that data is considered confidential to some degree. And as such, we are not always in the, we don't have the capacity to gather accurate information because simply persons are fearful of saying, because of the anti-gang legislation, if I was involved in a gang, it can possibly come back to hurt them in the future, that type of information. So we desire to have persons feel very comfortable in coming to our program. So we have decided we would not capture that type of information, but in speaking with our clients thereafter, we have found out that at least I would say 5 to 25% of them would have had some sort of interactions with gangs at some during the tenure of their criminal career. Let's put it as that. Okay, and could you inform me, remind your...
And in terms of the rehabilitation of persons that you do post-release,
yes,
would you say that those persons are open to the rehabilitation, even if they were involved in gangs? Because the remit of this particular inquiry is gangs. And
yes,
what would be some of the impediments you would have discovered, even anecdotally, without giving information about their identities or anything, obviously, for confidentiality and safety issues? Would they have indicated would be the impediments to not rejoining gangs upon their release or upon having completed your program?
What I can say is that the number of persons who come to us post-release that would have been involved in gangs are very small. And the analogy that I would like to use is, how easy is it to put an egg back together once it's been broken? So I want you to get that mental picture. So for many of them, that lifestyle, once they have already entered into it, it is extremely rare that some of them would deliberately seek out the assistance of organizations like Vision and Mission unless their lives are in danger. And we have clients like that currently, a very small percentage. We would say about 3 to 5% of our client population at our residential facility would have been in gang-related criminal activities. And it is a very difficult pathway of growth and reintegration for them. One of the major challenges is the ease at which they would have been able to make money prior their economic activity, that criminal economic activity produced by the gangs, and the ease of doing business in that particular way for them.
It's
All
interesting
right?
you use that term, the ease of doing business.
The ease
Quite
of doing
interesting.
business. Well, I'm trying to put it, couch it very nicely for them. And that is, it is lucrative. The connections are well formed. They are fully integrated, and us trying to show them an alternative pathway where it takes discipline, where it takes character, a reformation of the character, inculcating new morality, new perspectives. These things take time. So as we say, while the grass growing, the horse starving, because they also are trying to get new opportunities in traditional business modalities that tend to be very frustrating for them.
Is one of the issues that you have with persons coming back to you trying to walk the straight path, the lack of opportunity? Because in the 11th Parliament, I know there were actual persons who came out of the system, very successful gentleman, I remember, who was saying, although he was extremely well qualified, neither the state nor the private sector wanted to hire him. And he was actually hired by a state sector entity. And when they found out thereafter that he had a criminal record, they fired him.
Yes.
And he was as clean cut as you could get. I mean, not diminishing his past transgressions.
Of course.
And that's just one example of a person who, to me, tried and continues to try very hard, but is just not given a chance.
Yes, and data shows internationally as well. If you look at the research that was done in relation to gangs and criminal activities in Los Angeles, the major indicator for persons going back to a life of crime after being charged and incarcerated was the lack of job opportunities. And that is also the same for us. But in addition to the lack of opportunities, because the average man on the street would say, but yes, he could go and work in a grocery. Yes, he could do this. Yes, he could do that. So I want to stress here, there's a disparity in the lifestyle and the access to certain services and amenities that they would have lived within this gang culture that they now have to transition into. And the lack of, I would say, substantive employment is definitely the number one risk factor for recidivism, especially with regard to this type of criminal subpopulation, if you want to call it that. Your mic is unmuted, so I'm not hearing you.
Thank you so much. I want to go to Mr. Wilson and Mr. Husbands, both of whom had, first of all, also congratulations and thank you for both your service, because you're both well known as having sacrificed and contributed to prison institution in Trinidad and Tobago. And what your experiences would have been in terms of inmates that you would have interfaced with who would have come into the system and as either gang members or being inculcated in gang activity while in the system. And when they re-offended, what would be the main reasons for their re-entry into the system? And is the gang culture that easy, or is it difficult to get out of once you're into it? If we start with Mr. Wilson on that, please.
Thank you very much, Vice Chair, for giving me the opportunity to contribute. It's a very sophisticated and complicated issue. And one of the problems I always had was the fact that I don't think that we paid enough attention to the remand prison. And that was always an issue with me. Now, I would have interacted with a lot of the so-called gang leaders. In fact, I introduced, it is really a gang unit, but I could not call it a gang unit because of the illegality of gangs. So I call it a high-risk management unit. So I used officers who had the experience and had good relationships with these inmates to get a feel of what was happening on the ground, particularly when officers were being targeted and murdered. So that unit would move through the system and interact with these gang leaders all the time. And even those who chose to be members, in order to get a feel from inside, from in the trenches, so we would know how to deal with them. Now, one of the things when these younger persons come in fact, I'll tell you this, most times the so-called gang leader is not the person who activates, or I shouldn't say activate, because he or she could activate, but is not the person who gets involved in the actual crime. So you have what they call the foot soldiers. And the foot soldiers will join these gangs because they feel more accepted. They are influenced because they are offered, nice rewards, so that it's easy for those persons to be influenced on the outside. When they come in, they will be associated with their fellow gang members because they can get protection. The commissioner spoke about getting snacks, but when we think about snacks, we think about like corn curls and soft drinks, but it's not only that. Sometimes you get peanut butter, you get milk, you get these things, biscuits that would sustain them during the period that they are not being fed. So sometimes they're attracted by that, they're attracted by cigarettes and what have you. So it's easy to manipulate them to come over and join a so-called gang when they come into the system to feel better about themselves and safer in the environment. So it is easy to me on the outside. And then if you look at the outside, you will see that the so-called gang leaders, they drive nice vehicles. They live okay, they're able to socialize with a bit of affluence, so that when these younger persons look at them, they are enticed to form a unit and to belong to these persons who would be, to them, looking pretty well. Your mic here is mute.
Thank you, Mr. Husbands. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to contribute. I am going to speak from a different perspective because as part of the welfare department, we had the opportunity to visit communities. And I think part of our lack of understanding in terms of the pull and push factors is that we never had a community justice perspective in terms of looking at these organizations, institution-wise, from where these gang members came from. It speaks to the whole aspect in terms of what I like call disorganized communities, families, schools, businesses, churches operate where? They operate in a community, right? So if it isn't a community approach to what I like to call community justice in terms of what are the processes, what are the opportunities, what are the reintegrative or integrative opportunities within those communities, so that those persons would not see the gang as a de facto structure of employment. And I think that was a substantial pitfall in terms of addressing the gang situation in Trinidad and Tobago. But more than that, we focus more on what? Those who were caught, who came into the institution. And we never look at what I like to call the streams in terms of what were pulling those young persons into gang membership. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens if there are toxic or criminogenic factors within the communities. What do you expect? So I see Mr. Richards is laughing, but you see, it's more than just focusing on the family or the gang members. We have to focus on the community. What are the community processes? What are the norm affirmations? What are the standards? What do we expect in those persons who are unable to feed themselves, those who seem not to be able to go to school and remain in school with all the necessities to succeed? Where do they gravitate towards? What are the families? How are the families coping? do we have a system where if we identify families that are more or less predisposed to have their boys particularly join gangs without level of supervision and the like, what kind of intervention we have made in the communities in terms of providing a kind of support, care, supervision, and surveillance, right? It begins in that fundamental way in identifying those persons and having what we call wraparound services to support those families so that it mitigates against the risk factors so that persons wouldn't be pulled into the gang situation. That is one perspective. Now there's another area to this. The whole aspect in terms of what kind of norm affirmation we have set in those communities. Is it anything goes, or there must be some kind of standard in terms of how we want our citizens to live in those communities? This is easier said than done. I know this, but there must be some level, some standard in terms of school, in terms of I don't want to say values, but character qualities that would guide communities. What are the standards we are setting, or we allow anybody to set any standards? Not only standards are developed in schools, but standards developed in families. There must be what I call a family standard in terms of building character families. And that is where you're aspect of training persons who are so quote unquote parents or significant persons in communities to set those standards and share those standards. So it must be required, right? It must be emphasized and it must be recognized. And these things must be taught to parents, not in schools, but in communities. So the need for, again, for community justice and community standards, community processes, community reintegration facilities, but most importantly, we must make those communities organized so that they won't operate on disorganized premises.
Thank you.
To me, that is the approach. That is the approach.
Thank you so much to both of you.
You're welcome.
Before I go to my final question to Garth St. Clair and Natasha Nunez, you know, I recently read a couple of research papers that we talk about the issue of social inequities in academic and abstract terms. And the research papers indicated strong correlations between social inequity and value disparity. So very often, the premise of the studies were that policymakers thought, well, yes, there are social inequities, but even with those social inequities in particular areas in any jurisdiction, one expected the same moral values or the adherence to the same moral values, although there was a big disparity in the social provisions. And there was a strong correlation between, in all the studies, between areas or jurisdictions with large social disparity, social economic disparity, and you saw the correlations between the value system differentials. So don't expect me to follow your rules if I don't have the same opportunities as you. And we keep talking about these social inequities in abstract and academic terms, as opposed to in practical, everyday life terms. I think that is something we need to look at, but thank you for your intervention. Mr. St. Clair and Mrs. Nunez St. Clair, good to see you both. You're long-standing friends of mine. My question to you before I pass on to my colleagues is, what has your experience been in terms of your rehabilitation or your data with drug use or drug trafficking and gang involvement and gang activity? Let me start with the lady first on that, please.
I would prefer you go to the gentleman first, actually.
I yield to your wisdom, Mr. St. Clair.
Oh, well, good afternoon all, and thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity. Okay, I had the opportunity to, no, you asked about data, right, Mr. Richard?
Or anecdotal, because you interact with a lot of persons. Specific
Right.
data or anecdotal experiential intervention.
Right. Now, I had the opportunity to visit most of the stations, the prison stations around Trinidad and Tobago with vision and mission. And the very first thing we would do is take would ask questions of the inmates who would come to the session. Most of the time, these sessions would have 30, depends on which station we go to, 30, 35. And I'm hoping that Vision and Mission will still have that data because Michael was writing them down as I asked the question. And the question was, how many of you in here have drug-related offense? And how many of you here have been abusing drugs? And if there are 50 people or 50 inmates in the session, we would have at least 40 of them or even 45 of them raising their hands. And then I would ask them, what was the drug of choice? Most would say marijuana, and then there were polyaddicts. In ECRC, we had about 4 polyaddicts. Polyaddicts mean they were addicted to cocaine, marijuana, alcohol, pills, and other drugs. And all of them, 8 stations, and each of them, we would get that type of result. So, as anecdotal as it may be, it is very prevalent among the incarcerated population. And with regard to the as I said, we left that data with Vision and Mission, so they would have that in their possession, and it's something that I think for later reference probably they can submit. But drug use plays a very important part in all of them.
And what about, and I can't help but notice your strategic branding over your right shoulder.
That's the only time in Mr. Richards.
I'm just joking. And what is your information about drug trafficking, both in the country and internationally, and the association with gang activity? Because my information is that the gang heads are very often very involved in whom they second to do the trafficking, both in the Caribbean and across wider waters.
Right. We had the opportunity to visit a few prisons to interview female and male nationals who were incarcerated for drug trafficking, and this is in the UK and the US. And again, it's anecdotal, but what we found out, in the UK, there was about 13 nationals of Trinidad and Tobago at one point in time who were involved in drug trafficking. Now, some of them were recruited, some of them were coerced. And the ones who were recruited, but one significant thing was all of them came from what we describe as depressed communities. And when they after school, some of them went to Civilian Conservation Corps and they had to drop out and they were home, and they actually volunteered to traffic drugs. And some actually were recruited, some were tricked. Like during the last state of emergency, there was a house-to-house search by police, and this young lady saw some gang members stash some drugs behind her house, and she went and checked it afterwards, and they saw her and they told her, well, look, you have to traffic drugs for us, otherwise your family is going to be in danger. So what I know for sure is that in almost every community in Trinidad and Tobago, drug trafficking, and from it here and to overseas exist. However, it is more prevalent in the countries that, well, one so far that's the United Kingdom, is very prevalent in the United Kingdom because there's you don't need a visa to go there. So that it will be more prevalent, people more send people to the United Kingdom with drugs. And in the areas like the USA and Canada, you're talking about a higher level now, because you're talking about people who can acquire visas and have access, let that drug trafficker have straight access from one port to the next out and get the drugs delivered. So there are different tiers that we came across. And for instance, the young lady I told you about who was coerced by the gang, she got her belt to strap on herself, and we have that on tape from an official at the airport, because they took her straight to the airport and they told her, she said, well, I didn't get the drugs. She said, they told her, you don't worry, you just go sit and wait at the last port before you board the plane, and somebody will contact you there. And she said, lo and behold, somebody in uniform came to her, took her to the bathroom, a female, gave her a belt to strap on herself. And she left Trinidad with that belt, and she made it all the way out to Gatwick Terminal and to wait for the person to come pick her up. You know, they got caught. He was driving reckless. He decided to drive reckless, leaving the airport, and he almost hit someone, and he had to stop crossing a crosswalk, and he had to stop. And that's when police intervened and took them back inside and realized she had cocaine on her. That's a different level you're talking about, because she was able to go straight through undetected.
Thank you, Chairman.
If I may add,
Absolutely.
to reinforce what Garth has said about the link between drug use and drug trafficking and the gang activity. I mean, as Mrs. Chan said, that is one of the businesses of gangs. That's how they make money. And if we continue to have the demand, obviously there will be a market for illegal drugs. And to reinforce as well the involvement, as Garth just mentioned, of law enforcement, not just in the example that he cited, but I mean, I don't know, I think Mr. Wilson can probably bear me out on this, but it stands to reason that the so-called gang activity that takes place in prison and the trafficking of contraband, including drugs, into the prison would be facilitated by prisons officers and run by members of a particular gang within the prison. That's how they would be able to establish themselves and to recruit people to their fold. And I mean, it's for us in terms of the people that who have been caught, as we say. It's to go back to what Mr. Husband said about community justice. I mean, it's really not just the responsibility of the state or institutions to arrest this problem. I use that word arrest deliberately, but it's incumbent upon all of us as members of a community to do it, because we actually, if I can just give an example of an unrelated matter, that we had a survivor of child sexual abuse on our program last evening. And she lived in a upscale residential community, and she was abused by two members of her household. She was brutally beaten by her own mother, and no one in the community intervened to help her. So these things don't just occur, these breakdowns in family and values don't just occur in low-income communities. They happen all over the place. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to intervene where we can to arrest it.
Let me just add something to that too. With regard to the communities, now remember, there's a competition now for drug sales. And there's what you call is your opioids added to the list. There is also a number of communities where a lot of we found out about single parent community. So some of these youngsters who are going to school, some of them get recruited even at school level. We got parents who called us about children in primary school and secondary school. Now, what happens is that some of them cannot afford a lot of the things that they see some of their friends have, and some they don't know where they get it. So what they do on the block where they are, the heads of these communities or the so-called community leaders, they seek out these vulnerable folks, and $1,000 looks really attractive to someone who just spent the last $50 to buy some milk. So all they ask is, look, either you have drugs to take to school and sell, or you could sit high up the road and you have this radio and you could tell us what you've seen and you could be a lookout, or you can keep this for us. They have different choices. So a lot of youngsters going to school with drugs to sell in school already. and passing on these drugs to others. And then then came what we described as the Zessa pill. There are competitions with that too as well. So on different blocks, and you would find out that there's a brand of marijuana that young people are using that is inducing psychosis. And a lot of young men who don't know, some of them may have mental ill health running in their family, trying this marijuana that is obviously spiked and going and you know, having mental issues after they smoke it. And so, but why? If I'm running a block here and there's somebody competing with me just 5 blocks away, then I have to make my stuff stronger so that people gravitate to me. And if people still not gravitating to me, then that sort of escalates the gang warfare too as well. So there's a lot of fight for turf as well, you know, that causing the recruitment. And with this COVID situation that hit us here, we have more people to add to the list, because a lot of them, remember, a lot of young men who went to school, they went to the back of the class. Now, this COVID put everybody in the front row. So a lot of these young men who normally would go to class and sit in the back and do nothing, answer no question and take no question, and they are now put in the front row like everybody else. This is what online learning did for them. And a lot of them...
Or they're not logging on at all. Or they're not logging on at all.
No, or they're not, thank you, and they're not logging on at all because they can't deal with now that they're facing everybody. As I say, now they're in the front row like everybody else. And Miss could ask them a question and they're not able to answer because they are accustomed sitting in the back of the class. So they now not going to class, and what do? They want to have brands like everybody else. They want to have nice things like everybody else. So who's the best person to go to? The guy running the show on the block.
Let me recognize Member Lakshmi Dial, who would want now to make an intervention in this process. Member Lakshmi Dial.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I think my colleague, Senator Richards, covered quite an extensive amount of ground. So I just want to ask some specific questions coming out of the submissions and some of the things that we've already discussed. Let's start with, and I'm particularly concerned about this, recruitment at schools. Now, from what I'm hearing, recruitment in school, just like in the prison, there seems to be an economic factor. It's driven by need. It's driven by want and desire for things that money can buy, basically. So, but I'm also, and when we had our session with the Ministry of Education, I raised this question about persons who aren't children who aren't performing in schools and end up really becoming easy targets because they sort of just drop out of the school system, or they aren't successful and they are sort of left behind in the school system. In your experience, have you met persons, and either entity, this is for both organizations, have you met persons who present themselves, and do you notice, you mentioned mental health issues, but do you see persons with disabilities, learning disabilities, who, had they had an early intervention, would have been able to perhaps perform better in the school system and not be so susceptible to getting into a life of crime? Specifically, let me mention, because I've seen some persons, for example, children who, when they end up involved in crime at a young age, and when you speak to them, and these are children that I would have met through the children's court and so on, they actually have, to me, in my non-professional estimation of medical issues, maybe on the autism spectrum, may have, what did you call it, dyslexia, things like that. And I noticed those things, and I realized that sometimes these children are simply not being catered for in the education system, and they end up in a life of being attracted to a life of crime. So has it been your experience? Can you give me an idea of whether you've seen this for yourself in your work, in your line of work? I see Ms. Chance has her hand up. If you want to start, Ms. Chance.
Yes, if I may. And you are quite right, Honorable Senator. In your findings, Because what we have found for the few our clients that would have been transferred to us via probation from YTC, young lads, we would call them, adolescents, right? What we have found in our evaluation is that through our psychologists is that indeed they have some cognitive impairment. And that has presented itself over and over again, whether it be developmental delays, dyslexia, and other, or on the spectrum of being autistic. And that would be one. So that's the dominant finding that that presents itself in these cases. And following that, that is exacerbated oftentimes through the use of substances, whether it be alcohol or marijuana. So what we find is that condition is exacerbated. And then we also have persons presenting with mental issues as well that go beyond the cognitive dimension and go into mental health as well.
Do you feel that the majority of the mental health issues are, as was mentioned before, come out of drug use, or do you think that they are actual medical conditions that pre-exist the drug use, and the drug use is something that comes, or that follows because the person isn't able to function as a normal person in society with this undiagnosed mental health condition?
Yes, and we find it in both ways, both sides of the coin. So we have persons use narcotics and alcohol or marijuana or cocaine or whatever substance they use as a self-soothing mechanism, as a coping mechanism to just deal with life, to shield themselves. And we also have cases where the undiagnosed mental issues, psychotic episodes, get worse upon drug use or substance abuse. And this is where my colleagues, the Sinclairs, can come in and give some more elucidation in that regard.
Sure. I see Mr. Sinclair, has his hand up, and Mr. Husbands. So,
right.
Mr. Sinclair,
you can... Mr. Husbands.
Okay, he's giving way.
Okay, sure. Okay, in respect to your particular question, you focus more on schools, right? If, schools seem to be a risk factor, if I'm understanding your question properly. For my interaction with persons coming to the prison, when you look at their early life as it relates to school particularly, right? There always seems to be a low level of educational aspiration, right? I didn't find so much emotional or psychotic issues or drug use, but was a low level of educational aspiration, right? Which I thought was very prevalent among them. They were negatively labeled as well by teachers. Very, very important. In addition to that, there was educational frustration. And that more or less led to low commitment to school, right? Finding alternative ways to peers. So while they might be suffering in terms of low educational aspiration, that more or less pushed them into finding similar peers, right? And with that, it led to drug use, it led to getting into delinquent activities, and which led to dropping out of school. So two things stood out among most of the persons who I dealt with, whether they come from YTC or they came to the adult prison, was the level of academic aspiration or lack thereof, and then teacher expectations, and of course, the peer association that developed within the school that led to getting into gang operations, into communities, and of course, dropping out of school. For me, that was the whole cycle. So there was limited, what I call limited adherence or limited bond to education aspirations. For me, that was the main risk factor in terms of what happened in the schools. And again, teachers' expectations. They don't get the kind of support, right, in this education system because they didn't show the kind of propensity to want to learn. So those were the two major factors when you looked at the impact, right, of the school system that led as a factor that I don't say push, but provided the opportunities for those individuals to choose to get into gangs and associate more with delinquent peers.
When you use a term there, educational frustration. Is
Definitely.
it something? I mean, expand just very briefly for me. What do you understand, or how should we interpret that term?
It stems from low educational aspirations. Education really is not prized per se, neither by the individual or the families or the communities from where they come, right? So and that is exacerbated by low teacher expectations. So you're coming from there anyway, so I'm not going to pay much attention to you. I'm sure you're going to fail. So those were the two factors they identified.
Right. The long and short of what you're saying then is that you have a lack of ambition that collides with a lack of expectation.
That's right. Every family expectation.
Every sinew in my being is crying. What if I could just interject here, Chairman? Yeah. There's one thing to say a lack of educational aspiration, but we also have to consider poor teacher engagement.
Definitely.
So it's not just the student doesn't want to learn. Nobody ever just doesn't want to learn. If the system is not catering for your learning style or dealing with your issues, it is not just somebody get up in the morning and say, I don't want to learn. Nobody doesn't want to do well. So we need to be mindful of it's not only a lack of educational aspiration. Sometimes the system fails the student. Just wanted to put that in there.
And it leads to low commitment, low adherence, or low attachment to education, right? More so if it isn't supported in the homes, if that is the mindset to in the homes. So teachers, I'm not blaming teachers. I'm saying that they must recognize that when they recognize educational aspiration is low and leading to frustration, they have a hell of a job to try to change that mindset so that the young person develop that desire to learn, that they must see they have that ability to succeed. They must see the reason to learn, the need to learn, and to develop that commitment. And that must be motivated by not only the teacher, by the families, the parents, as it were, right? Because what happens is when they gravitate towards the gangs, it becomes a family, it becomes the protectors, and it became the de facto employers. And they feel quite comfortable there. That is what I like call the education frustration cycle that leads a push towards gang affiliation, because they find a home, they find a family, they become protected, and of course, facto employment.
Let me make a quick intervention here. I gather if Senator Richards's implied suggestion in his question, and the response is, as it just came from Mr. Husband, an authoritative voice on this matter, who told us, and I quote, "I'm not blaming teachers." Then who do we blame? If it is that poor teacher engagement is at least a part of this issue, then it must mean that we must focus on the teaching platform to ensure that that aspect of the contribution to the problem we're dealing with is resolved.
Yes.
So I am not so easily I'm not so easily persuaded by the I am not blaming teachers thing. And then you added the parents. So it seems to me.
I think that something has to come in here with teachers, because we don't seem to have that level of issues in certain schools, and it's teachers that make the difference when you have we don't see this problem being so prevalent in schools unless we really on the denominational schools. So there must be something different in the educational platform and with the teachers that's happening that we're not seeing happening in some of the other schools.
Well, teachers operate in a system. Let's keep that in mind. It's not the teachers alone. Teachers operate in an education system.
Correct. So let me say before we press on, before we allow Madam Lakshmi Dayal to continue, from the evidence in front of us and from what we've heard today from these very experienced operators in this business, this exists in all schools.
Yes.
I accept that it may be more prevalent in some, but it in fact exists in all schools. One of the prime denominational schools in the city, they will tell you, they'll tell you quietly, but they have had issues with drugs, they have had issues with all kinds of antisocial behavior. So let me say, for all the evidence tells us it exists in all schools. The point I was making, though, is that it appears to me from the submissions I've heard that there's responsibility for dealing with this problem all along the chain, from the individual to the family, meaning parents and the family, to the community, to the police engagement, to the teacher engagement, to the adults in the, I mean, it's just all along the process. And therefore, it's not about blaming. I think we must begin by understanding, all of us as professionals, all of us as operators, all of us as leaders, as parents, as seniors, whatever. We all have a responsibility in this. So I spare none.
The new paradigm, Chairman, is if the child has not learned, the system has failed, not the child.
Well, that might be so, but I'll tell you something. I read in one of these documents, and I don't want to take too much of Madam Lakshmi Dayal's time, but let me tell you this. I read in the Eye on Dependency document, and this is a truthful proposition, that there are inmates in our system, and Mr. Former Commissioner
Wilson,
who is with us, and Mr. Husbands. Eye on Dependency is saying here, in their document submitted to us, that there are inmates, there are persons who find themselves with no academic qualification inside of the system, and now they have 8 and 10 CXC passes and CAPE passes and degree and all kinds of stuff. So it is not that the individual didn't have the capacity. Very often it is not that the system, because some of his peers would have gotten their 8 in school. It is maybe sometimes the individual is not as receptive for some of the reasons we have brought here today as he should be. So Chairman, it's a mixture of all of this.
Chairman, you're presuming that education is 8 CXCs alone. Education is moral and value inculcation.
We understand
education
that.
System is family.
We understand
you could have 8 O-levels and bad like hell.
We understand all of that. In fact, we have professionals, we have lawyers. Anyway, Madam Lakshmi Dayal, please proceed.
Thank you. The other point that I noted, you recommended in terms of the process of making progress towards transforming prisons and as well as community residences more towards a rehabilitative model. Vision and mission, the use of cognitive behavioral therapy type programs. In your experience, have you been able to use those types of programs in terms of the prisoners or ex-prisoners that you would interact with? And has it been successful? And are the resources readily available for that level of intervention? I think that's a very high level. You need trained professionals to implement a program such as that. Are those resources available locally? Again, for let's say persons we want to transition out of the prison system and back and reintegrate them into society.
Yes, so if you would allow me to begin, I will just make way for you, Mr. Husbands, to go even deeper after giving my brief opening remarks as relates to this question. All right. And the answer is yes. As an NGO, we are equipped. Our staff has been trained, has undergone training, training the trainers program, and we are equipped with moral recognition therapy training, which really identifies social, behavioral, moral issues, moral approach, towards cognitively changing behavior and looking at the mind, the reasoning, why they do what they do. Also, I just want to touch upon our pre-release program. In addition to those moral recognition therapy, where they understand the importance of ethical principles, their self-esteem, we also look at character first, right? Character first development, why personal integrity is important, what value is it to you? And yes, through our psychologists and our trained staff, we are able to conduct these, do this type of transformation through several modalities: individual therapy, group therapy, workshops as well. So that's a brief introduction.
Is accountability and accepting accountability for one's actions and for one's future action, does that feature heavily in the work that you do? Because again, and specifically with young children that I've met through the children's support system, I find there's a serious lack of accountability. And there's almost still, and this comes from as well, I guess, because we're still on that punishment type model, where there's a mindset that as long as I am convicted or fined or whatever judgment is passed on me at the court, well, that's it. But there's no action. But that's not accountability. Accountability goes much deeper than that. And there isn't a lot of emphasis on accountability in the justice system as it's in the true judiciary. So is it that through the work that you're doing, the more psychological type work and intervention, and is the prison conducive to rolling out programs that would, or as you call them, the pre-release program? I think that's excellent. Having a pre-release program where persons are forced to sort of confront that issue of accountability. But is the prison really equipped at this point in time? And have you met a lot of persons who are released? Let's say 100 people being released. How many of them are actually, being forced to confront that issue of accountability before they get back into the system? Because if there's no accountability and you go back out there, then the risk of reoffending, to me, seems very high.
Yes. And I would allow my colleagues to, I'm going to just answer your question briefly and allow my colleagues to share as well. The answer is very, very little of them, I would say, come out of prison with that awareness, and we call it the law of awareness in our pre-release program. So we deal with the laws of intentionality, the laws of awareness. We deal with the criminal mask. We deal with battling your shadows, all designed. These are modules in our pre-release program, all designed to make you look inward, to accept responsibility for what you have done, and the role you would play now in the restorative process, right? So that speaks to accountability. This is what I have done. This is now the pathway I have to walk and what I need to do to get there. Now, I must say that persons come into our program voluntarily for the moment. So it is not mandated for prisoners in the convicted section to come to our program when they are due to be released. So it's just voluntary, and that is something that we would like to see changed. So I would give way to my colleagues to respond.
So before you start, so there actually is right now at the moment no mandatory type of intervention or program that you must do before being released. That's basically
no. It is entirely voluntary.
Okay. So it's possible for someone to be convicted of a violent crime, be inculcated in a gang or participate in gang activity in the prison for the entirety of their term, serve their term, and then one day say, okay, term is up, and they just walk back out on the street, and no one actually ever has the opportunity to get into their head and help fix whatever issues or demons they're carrying around with them, as we say sometimes.
That's correct. And it's even worse in remand because there's no opportunity infrastructurally to facilitate all program designed for remanded inmates, which a large majority of the gang-related persons come in and out of
And the
prison.
next question is about that, but yeah, so we'll just
Yes.
I think Ms. Nunez has her hand up for some time now.
Sure, yes.
I actually just wanted to talk back to your first question, Ms. Lakshmi, about the education system. And just to mention that in 2018, we, having observed what was happening in the school system, implemented a program, voluntary program called Ready, Set, Grow, because we recognized that the transition from primary to secondary was an extremely traumatic period, especially for 11 to 13-year-olds. And parents obviously were not prepared, or were not preparing their children for that transition. In addition to which, there is no drug education on the curriculum. So children are going into secondary school and being exposed to a number of legal and illegal drugs and situations like gang activity, like sexual activity, and not being prepared for it. So we started that program in the hope that we would engage our audience and engage those first formers, and really try to teach them about what they would encounter when they got to secondary school. And I take on board the previous discussion about teachers being part of the problem. They are. Let's face it, they are. But parents as well are also unprepared, under-resourced, and unable in many instances of families that we have dealt with to handle children in the school system. And Mr. Hines said as well, it's not just in non-denominational schools, it's happening. We have had calls from parents whose children go to the so-called prestige schools, and these issues are quite prevalent therein as well. I don't know if Garth had anything to add to that.
Yes, I would like, and thank you very much, Slosbijial. I do want to take away from what you went on to next, but I had my hand up to add something to the part with the school system. One, there's a problem, and we also advocated for why not make parent-teachers meetings mandatory? Because the only time you see parents is at the beginning of the school term when they have that big thing going on, everybody's signing up. And then when I'm asked to speak at a PTA meeting, when I ask how many students in the school, some would say 100, 200, 150. And in the multipurpose hall, we just have about 10 to 15 mothers, maybe 1 or 2 fathers. So that is a problem. The teachers and the parents don't interact at all, or minimally. That interaction is minimal between them. Now, let me use me as an example. I came from, although my mother grew us up alone, but was well-grounded. She grew us up. I was, but there was a problem with low self-esteem, because during the time my father and her were together, they were fighting constantly. And when parents fight, they don't understand how much it affects the children. And then when some children hear, well, your head big just like your father, you're stupid just like your father, you're worthless just like your father. And that child grown up with low self-esteem. My mother was, children should be seen and not heard. So I had to fight to even play sports, because, I refereed a basketball game, and my brother went home and tell my mother, and she almost beat me for doing that, because who tell you to referee basketball game? And so children grew up with low self-esteem. And then when you have a father tell you you're dotish. And so when I went to the military, it was easy to convince me that crack cocaine was the thing to use to help me study, because I wanted to achieve. And this older soldier who introduced crack cocaine to the military was able to convince me, despite my physical ability and being a physical training instructor with just 4 years service, he was able to convince me that to try something illegal so they could keep me up in the night to get 5 subjects, because I just had 2. So low self-esteem is part of the problem. And then poor coping skills. And there are parents now who will know, because some of the cases that we came across lately is that some parents never have the discussion with their children that their grandfather or grandmother was an alcoholic or a drug addict, or the great grandfather, or they had mental issues. So there are families where mental ill health is prevalent, but sometimes it skips a generation. So if my grandfather was an alcoholic, chances are it might have skipped my great grandfather, might skip my grandfather and come to my father, and then it skip my brother and jump on me. So now parents need to have that discussion. I tell them all the time, it is not something that you can hide any longer, because people who have mental ill health running in their family, you have 4 children, one of them will succumb to it, and the first joint that they smoke or the first drink that they take, it ignites that and brings on mental psychosis, and they go through psychotic episode. And so these are the different issues that we came across that are affecting children in school. So the low self-esteem person is not going to put up their hand to answer a question quickly. They will wait until they see others do it, and because they don't have confidence in themselves, and that's part of the problem to us.
Understood.
So Sinclair?
Let me just ask one quick question before I'm at risk of being one of those mothers that they say never show up on time for their children. But just quickly, because I'm with you, Mr. Sinclair, and this comes out straight from your submission. You mentioned something in your submission about the remand prisoners, and I'm particularly interested in this statement where you said that remand prisoners aren't outfitted by the prisons, and the lack of things that are available to them sort of fuels that gang recruitment, because they look to the gangs and they look to even the illegal contraband system to provide basic needs. Now we had I don't know if you saw it, we had a live session with the Commissioner of Prisons where we addressed some of those issues of basic needs being met, but not the contraband type things that prisoners want access to. I'm concerned about your statement and your interaction with prisoners. I think somebody's mic, the interaction with prisoners. You said things like snacks. Well, I know cigarettes is contraband, but snacks that would provide sustenance and drink between meals is something that they basically lacking, clothing and so on, aren't provided by the prison. So is it that you think that these basic necessities aren't being provided by prisoners is a driving factor behind remand prisoners specifically? And I say that because I will always say when you are on remand, you're still supposed to enjoy the presumption of innocence. And if you are someone who is presumed innocent and only accused of a crime and you have not had your day in court, but you are deprived of basic needs, which drives you into a gang or drives you or influences your decision to become part of a gang, I think that's a very serious matter.
Yes, it is. And you're correct, because remember, there are some people who end up on remand, especially, they don't get visits. Some of them, their families cannot afford it. And that way, they are really at the mercy of the guys inside there, because when they want to get, as you said, once feeding time is over, and I'm sure Mr. Wilson is also going to bear me out on this, I experienced it myself, at 5, maybe 5:30 around there is nothing to eat until the next morning. And that way now, what do I do? So I could stay hungry by 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, I'm hungry again. So if it is I don't have access to my own stuff because nobody is coming to pay me a visit, if I cannot get a proper pair of sneakers, and brands are a thing too inside there. And if I can't get a proper pair of sneakers, then what do I do? Sit and look at everybody? Or if I want to be part of that, I could be easily influenced, especially again, if I have low self-esteem. So, and remember, the prison don't provide a special kit. I don't know if they're doing it now, but I know when I was there, there's no kit for remand prisoners and kit for convicted prisoners. So they need to have these change of clothes as well. So, and what do? That's easy to recruit somebody who wants, remember, that somebody who wants or even needs will gravitate to where they have it. So if it is you, I remember one evening I was inside there and the guy next to me, a prison officer, bought some food for him, and he opened that container. It was a Monday, and there was a little bit of Sunday lunch remain, and that he got, And I almost died of hunger. Those worms almost killed me because I was smelling, and I could have identified everything he had in his bowl without looking, because I didn't have anything to eat, and my mother couldn't bring herself to come into the prison as yet. So I spent there at least 2 or 3 weeks without any visit, and I almost, even look in the bowl to see what it is. I might ask him a piece, but I knew I wasn't supposed to go that route. What about the guys who weak and cannot stand that pressure mentally? And that is
the conditions to that. The conditions themselves. If you come from a 3-bedroom home and you find yourself in remand, how mentally to adjust to that physical space, being in a confined space with 10 or 11 other men?
Don't talk for that, because when I remember the cell that they had us in with about 8 other men. It had a door this thick, about 6 to 8 inches thick, with just a hole, and we stayed in there for a while. And then when we were finally transferred to Golden Grove, now picture this: you live in this hot environment because Port Spain was always hot, and then we go into Golden Grove, which is a cold environment, and they give us this very thin paper-thin carpet to sleep on. So I had to sleep on the floor. I got the deadliest cold that I ever thought could have befallen mankind, that I couldn't even eat the what they gave us to eat on a morning. As I swallowed it, I brought it back up because the cold stayed on my chest. Why? Because I was sleeping on a very cold floor. And I had to take, in Port Spain, I had to take a pail and carry it outside because I was the last one to come in the cell, and carry it outside and dump it in a bin for it to burn it. And seeing men bathing naked in the yard, and listen, it was like a total wake-up call. And we must let you know that there's a violation right now with some parts of our system. When talking about human rights violation, and it needs to fix like yesterday.
Mr. Husbands, I recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In direct response to Ms. Latmedial's question in terms of the cognitive behavioral approach, and if the prison is poised to deliver those things. And she also spoke about our submission. We spoke about rethinking rehabilitation. Firstly, what is rehabilitation? I think we really need to redefine it. And there are 2 strands, right, in corrections when we talk about rehabilitation. And the first aspect is humanitarian reform. And that speaks to the order, the amenities, and the services, and the training of your staff, right, to deliver the cognitive behavioral therapies, which is what we call evidence-based approach to modern day corrections. Yes, you can have psychology, you could have psychotherapy, but that just makes the inmate feel good about himself, right? You talk about accountability within the evidence-based approach. It is based on what we call community justice and community responsibility to recognize that you have left victims outside here, you have destroyed the peace and the shalom of society, and you have a responsibility to mend those things. And this speaks to the whole aspect in terms of restorative justice. Now, you may ask, how do you proceed with this? When we talk about evidence-based, you talk about certain processes. You must have a proper, what you call an actuarial instrument to measure risk and needs, right? To identify the needs, to identify the learning styles, to identify the level of need, and how you, what we call responsivity, how you develop programs individually to suit the needs, right? So that you help the individual develop what we call in corrections a level of self-determination. It's all about a motivational approach to things. If the individual doesn't have the desire, he doesn't seem to have the ability, he doesn't see the need and the reason to change, and not that a commitment, there's very little that can happen. And here comes the officers with the what we call motivation interviewing, right? With those skills to motivate the individual to understand that any transformation begins with him. The staff and the officer is going to be support and provide them with the amenities and the services and the support. Yes. But you must get the individual to take responsibility. And that is where the cognitive behavioral therapy comes in. It's based on the moral theory to change criminal thinking.
Thank you.
And people must understand, and staff must understand that people have the capacity to change, to do good or to do bad. But it's all about you. Stop making excuses. And when they feel that sense of guilt, you teach them about the criminal mask, right? There are about 15 aspects of the criminal mask that you train your staff to identify and share with individuals. And then you have to teach them to change through education, not only academics, right? But morality, history, civility, character first, and all of these things. Then you have to give them the what you call the gift of self-concept, right? They are not infinite, and they don't have a limited fixed capacity. God gave them our capacity to think, our intellect, and they'll be able to see that they have the capacity to rise above the environment, even in dilapidated conditions. But I'm saying there must be proper humanitarian standards. But more than that, you have to teach them what we call the keys to freedom. They must understand how to adhere to law, order, morality, and justice. And all of these things must be part of what we call
Thank you
approach. Right? But more than that, my Mr. Chairman, there must be a clear policy on resettlement. From the time they come in, you have to prepare them with accountability plan, a correctional plan, and
I would like to suggest, Mr. Husband, that particular, before I allow Madam Webster Roy to come in, that particular thing about this clear rehabilitation or re-entry plan that you just described, I would like to receive that in writing for the benefit of this community. I know you are tremendously experienced, a lot to say, but we may not have the time to treat with all of that this afternoon. We look forward to that in clear writing from you as a team. Let me invite Madam Webster Roy.
Without crossing you, please, the CEO already has that in documentation form, and she can make a copy of it in terms
Thank you very kindly. Thank you.
Re-entry policy from prison to community.
Madam Webster Roy, please.
Chair, just before Minister Webster Roy takes, I need to take my leave. Unfortunately, I have.
You're more than welcome. You're more than welcome.
Thank you.
Travel safely. Thank you very kindly, Madam Webster Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to ask all of the persons appearing before us just to elaborate or make recommendations. In doing some research, it was identified that prevention, intervention, and suppression is the approach towards curbing gang activity. Based on your collective experience, in terms of prevention, what policy measure would you recommend? In terms of intervention, or again, what policy measure would you recommend? And in terms of suppression, what policy measure would you recommend? That's one. And when I was reading the submission from on Dependency, it was really interesting. And I came across a paragraph that spoke to the radio program, and it said the radio program at the maximum security prison managed to survive, but it has not been following the mandates and guidelines as was originally intended for implementation. And I wanted Ion Dependency to elaborate and to say, well, what is lacking now, what the program was intended to do, and how can we strengthen our program to bring about better changes within the prison system.
Mr. Sinclair.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Madam Webster Roy, for that question. Thank you so much. Remember, prison radio was a step in a different direction to restorative justice. So fortunately, we have met Mr. Gordon Husbands and Mr. John Roger at the time. When we discovered prison radio in the United Kingdom, we brought it back to Trinidad and Tobago. And when we approached the then Ministry of Justice, we had to twist some arms, but Mr. Bolney was convinced from a demonstration done by two gentlemen that who the British High Commission brought to Trinidad and Tobago. So we installed the prison radio station. It was opened by His Excellency Arthur Snell. But the problem was, remember, we have prisons officers and not correctional officers. This instrument came from a correctional environment. So when I asked the commissioner at the time, Mr. Martinez, who took over from Mr. Roger, look, let us introduce this to the executive first, because I know this is something new. remember, we have officers in there who more punitive and retributive. They wouldn't understand this. But he said, no, go ahead. So I was given carte blanche to take equipment into the prison and recruit. So we recruited, with the help of Mr. Urban, we recruited officers and offenders to start this radio station. We trained them, we opened the radio station. As I said, the problem was acceptance. That was the first problem. Then we were given the mandate to wire all the prisons, but the funds that were promised to us, we never got it. So we got $400,000 actually to start a radio station. We did, however, and we handed it over. When Mr. Volney was removed, now we presented a vision and mission to them. We presented a total package, one that includes the executive hour that we saw out there, which is any minister of government or the prison commissioner has an hour that's mandated to them, that will be mandated to them to go and speak to the prison population with whatever you want to discuss with them and pass on information and all of that. And of course, the person who took over from Mr. Volney, she did not like the idea. She said Mr. Volney should have never come up with this idea because he didn't know anything about media. And she treated us like, I was feeling real proud to know that, hey, we delivered something to this country that they could have used as a restorative justice tool. Instead, Madam wanted to shut it down. But Officer Spring decided that this is not going to shut down, you're going to keep it together. But the officers decided we had to go. So with the Minister of Justice at the time and the people around her, they decided, well, no, we can't let civilians run this, let the prison officers run it. And they started to run it the way they felt that it should have been run. So the programs that we had set out, like, you know, like our radio station runs, but this time for they go to retrofit it for the prison population, to educate the prison population and numerous things. And it was just barely making it. And then the problem was they changed the head of the radio station like every 2 months. So when you think there was one person running the radio station that was moved, they bring another person, he came with a different idea, and the interest started to wane. The people who graduated went off to other parts of the prison population, and it's just barely hanging on, because between Mr. Wilson, Mr. Stewart, they saw the need for it, and they sort of probably, it survived under them. Since then, we have not been involved in it.
Let me ask Mr. Wilson, who was engaged as leader of the prison service at that time, what was the to answer Madam Webster Roy's, part of Madam Webster Roy's question? What was the rationale? What was the anticipation? What was the expected outcomes of this radio program in the prison?
Well, according to God, the thing is, it started with some issues, Chairman, that I don't want to get too much involved with.
No.
But I know there was some.
What we want to know is what was the objective? What was the rationale? What was the outcome we expected from the radio station? That's all.
All right, okay. Well, it was a rehabilitation tool, a reformation tool. Inmates would have been able to almost run the facility, and then some of the officers would have gotten training, a level of training from I think Holly Thomas was one of the persons who would have trained them in broadcasting and so on. So there was that rehabilitation part of it, where the officers would work in the studio and assist the inmates to also become broadcasters. Apart from that, according to what God said just now, the commissioner and other officers will be able to filter information, or positive information, through all the different institutions, and send positive messages that would in itself would have been a rehabilitative tool. So the radio would have been used as a method of changing.
Thank you. Got that. Madam Webster Roy, please.
Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, if I could intervene for 1 minute.
Yes, please. Just keep it cryptic and short, because I want Madam Webster Roy to continue.
Continue, yes. Just to add that the model that we brought down from the UK was changed significantly, in that the UK model involved outside civilians coming in to establish the radio station. In the Trinidad and Tobago model, it was a prison officer, prisoner delivered content for the prison population. And I think that's
I take the point. Take the point.
And also, as well as a restorative tool, a tool of restorative justice for the prison population, the kind of content and programming that we intended to have on RMR would have involved the reintegration process, would have involved the skills training in terms of the broadcasting skills. It would have involved mediation so that offenders can mediate their issues with the victims, so that we can bring victims and offenders together to help them to heal. And also, you know, the entertainment, because you are in a confined space, and radio as a tool of a media tool to communicate information and educate and entertainment.
Point taken. Thank you.
Yeah.
Point taken. Madam Webster Roy?
One particular objective, right? It
Mr.
was
Husband?
to change the ethos of the prison, because we wanted to change what was bombarding the inmates when they listen in the cells with different vocabulary.
Yeah, we understand that. We got that. We got that. Thank you. Thank you. Madam Webster Roy.
I wanted to go back to my first question where I asked from their collective experience, what policy measure would they recommend under prevention, intervention, and suppression that isn't already existing?
At the school level, ma'am?
At school level as well as prison.
Okay. If I may, I just have one suggestion, that when I go to schools to lecture, at times I would identify immediately who are the ones who, you know, you see them with the back copybook in their back pocket and all this type of thing. Mr. Hines now is in the very unique position to make this happen. I know it would take some doing, but my suggestion would be, we are allowing youngsters who have no academic qualification or vocational skill to leave school in that manner. And once they leave school and they filter out into society, that's it, we've lost them. So directly what we're doing, we're providing gang members to gang leaders. So my suggestion would be to identify them from that level, and as soon as the 5-year term comes to an end, you let them run, do what they have to do. But as soon as that 5-year term comes to a level, you take them and you carry them further to another 2-year program, whether we call it boot camp or national service or whatever. That's a safety net, so that we cut off that supply from the gang leaders who are waiting for them to come home, because they know they're coming home with nothing after they finish school. And I think that's one of the ways to identify and nip them in the bud from there, because as I said in what we submitted, I've met them in prison, and Andrew Douglas is one of them. Andrew Douglas went to prison when he was 19 and couldn't get even school leaving. Andrew Douglas have about 20 subjects now. So which means with 20 subjects with a conviction for murder, that is not going to do him any good when he's released, if he's released at all. So I think that's one of my suggestions.
You are proposing essentially something of a compulsory national service program.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Without a doubt.
Right. We record your recommendation, but just to let you know that has, in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, we've looked on this, but in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, with a written constitution, including freedom of association and freedom of movement and that sort of thing, that proposal has constitutional implications for Trinidad and Tobago. In addition to that, that proposal had been offered to this country years ago, and it was mired in controversy. And therefore, there is no national consensus that recommendation will find fertile ground upon. So it is a matter to be resolved, whether it is voluntary or mandatory. For the time being, we do have voluntary elements of that in the CCC and the MyLAT and the MyPAT, and those from all the reports are working quite well. and maybe it might mean expansion of those for the time being, and a whole lot of consideration. But it is not a matter that has escaped the attention of the government. Let me invite Madam Webster-Roy to continue.
I'll open up that question to all our
guests,
yes.
all of them present here. Well, yes. Mr. Husbands, the question was, what would you propose along the lines as asked by Madam Webster-Roy? As cryptically as you can.
Sure. It speaks to developing youth justice, a balanced youth justice restorative approach, still based on community justice. And that has a lot to do with getting people like probation, community social workers in schools, in the communities that deal with different processes of restorative justice, community involvement, reintegration policies. But ultimately, it must be a balanced approach to divert a young people away from the courts and the prisons in the community programs. You already have community policing, a wonderful thing, but you must have community social workers in the communities. You must have probation officers working in the schools in the communities. You must have police officers with the capacity to already have it, the caution and warn, and not bringing all those persons who they find probably a stick of marijuana or minor offenses, right, to court. They have the policy on the law books, the caution and the warn, and divert them into the very community police youth groups or in probation supervision, place them on a diversion program, rehabilitation program, but that comes from a whole policy in terms of community justice and the whole aspect in terms of youth justice. It has nothing to do with criminal or juvenile justice. It's about youth justice. How do we integrate them and keep them and support them, right, in the communities so that they don't become hardened delinquents.
Thank you very much.
Prevention, suppression.
Thank you. Now, gentlemen and ladies, it is now from my clock screaming 4:54 p.m. We do not wish to, for a number of logistical reasons, go beyond 5 p.m. So it means we may have to ask you to return to us because clearly there's a lot more useful to be said. I would like, for the time being, to invite Mr. Scotland, who is with us, to ask any question or questions that he may have in the short time available to us. Mr. Scotland. Mr. Scotland, I understand, folks, that there was some problem with some connectivity. Maybe he's afflicted by that. So let me take the opportunity.
Chairman?
Yes?
Yes, I am here. Please. I just got some, but I'm here.
The floor is yours.
I thank you. I asked this question directly. I know time is of the essence. On dependency, I looked at your submission and I saw at the very outset of it, you stated, and this is at page 1, that specific measures implemented to identify vulnerable youth are non-existent until they leave school. Piggybacking on my learned colleague, Mrs. Ayana Webster-Roy, and Honorable Minister, and I know that this chairman is very active, Mrs. Webster-Roy is very active, and the Honorable Minister of Education is very active. Do you think that in improving the curriculum to include awareness of these issues would assist in helping potentially vulnerable youth not to be lured into gangs?
Yes, sir. Of course. One is, as we proposed in the past and we continue to do so, substance abuse on the curriculum. That must be made part of that must be mandated now. You see, drug use have grown by leaps and bounds, and we cannot just leave it up to the devices of the children. Whoever knew that cough syrup and Sprite would have been a thing in schools. So we must put...
Well, time, I know that, and I take the chairman's word as to time. So you think that the introduction of substance abuse on the curriculum, Chairman, we have our most efficient secretariat gotten that?
Say that again?
Chairman?
If we have some... That's a question for the chairman.
Madam Samson Miguel, have we gotten that as a positive submission coming from Vision on a Mission? I mean, from Iron Dependency? Chairman?
Mr. Scotland?
Chairman, have you gotten that?
Yeah, we have.
Good. I asked the second question. I asked this to both Iron Dependency and Vision. What can be done to make the gang lifestyle and the lure of the attraction to gangs as a lifestyle less attractive? What would you recommend?
So Wilson? I would give way to Mr.
Yeah, oh yes, Mr. Wilson, unless you have a contribution.
Okay, Mr. Scotland, my view is that we have to look at the infrastructure of prisons, and we have to look at the overcrowded and the fact that we must have proper streamlining and separate the first timers from the seasoned offenders, and try as much as possible to keep the foot soldiers away from those who would have the influence. So I think that one of the critical things would be the success of any rehabilitation program or reformation program will lie in the structure of the prison. And if you look at the remand facility at Golden Grove, you will know that it is in no way prepared for the type of programming and the type of intervention we need if we are to separate the foot soldiers from those who are the influencers.
I would like to quickly add that we need to provide alternative employment and economic opportunities. We need to ensure that persons coming out of prisons who would have been involved in gang-related activities have access to alternative entrepreneurial pathways. We are doing that as an NGO. We are providing those opportunities through agriculture and different forms of skills retraining. So I think there needs to be a holistic and collaborative stakeholder approach to empower these persons economically.
I think, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scotland?
Chairman, I have a chairman, and I don't mean to be political, but
Please.
Don't you think that the anti-gang legislation, Chairman, I do not wish to be political, but it's a fact, brought by this government to Parliament would have assisted in the curbing of gang membership and gang activity. I ask that to all the participants, and I ask it for a reason.
I would direct that question, since we don't have time for everyone to answer. I will direct that very pointed and potent question to Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Wilson, as a former head of the prison service, and as a man steeped in the work of Vision and Mission, the question is whether in the opinion of Vision and Mission, and then I'll ask our Dependency, Mr. Dad Sinclair, whether in your opinion, Vision on Mission holds the view that anti-gang law would have been a useful tool in this issue of protecting vulnerable youth from gang engagement and all that flows badly from it.
Chairman, I totally agree. I totally support it with whatever modifications, but I totally support it.
Thank you.
It is something that we must look into.
Thank you very much. Let me direct that to Iron Dependency in the person of on this occasion, in the person of Mr. Garth Sinclair.
Thank you, Chairman.
Would you, on behalf of Iron Dependency, the question is whether you think anti-gang law has any value, any role in the context of diverting vulnerable youth away from that lifestyle.
Like yesterday, Mr. Chairman. like yesterday.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Chairman, that those would be
Scotland.
my truncated questions because of time. But Chairman, you have heard the answers. I did not ask it as a political question. I asked it because it's a real question, Chairman, that must be addressed now. These are the experts who are saying that the legislation that we have brought to Parliament have assisted, Chairman.
Right so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is just past 5 p.m. Very interesting discussion, very weighty issues for our contemplation, but time has run. We are almost certain that we might want to ask you to be with us again because there are some other issues that we have not yet broached for our benefit and for the benefit of the citizens of the Republic who are viewing and listening this. So I would like...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Sinclair?
Can we hold you to that?
No need, no need. We see the value of this. We know you all have been in the field. You all have tremendous experience in this, and yours are very, very relevant contributory voices, and we would not miss out on this opportunity as this committee, on behalf of the larger Parliament and on behalf of the national community, want to understand more about these issues so that we can do better, we can plan better, we could respond better and save more of our young people. So no need to hold us to it. We are with it. So I would like, therefore, on behalf of the Joint Select Committee on National Security of the Parliament, to thank Vision on Mission for your presence here today. Madam Chance, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Husband, and of course, thank Ion Dependency for your presence and your contribution as well. Mr. Garth Sinclair and Natasha Nunez Sinclair. Let you know we really appreciated your presence. You have shed great light on many of the issues that we traversed today, and we will ask you to be with us, I'm almost certain, in the near future again. So we would like to thank you, and I would like to suspend this element, this public hearing or sitting, in order that you would demit this space so that we would continue. Thank you all very much. Good luck and God bless. Make it safely back to your workstations and your homes.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair.
My pleasure.
Thank you all very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Chair and committee members.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. So this meeting is for those reasons suspended.